All right, so this video we're going to show you all of the ins and outs for installing subfloor on wood substrate. So here we go. First step, screw down your original substrate. Now, in this particular case, I'm dealing with a 140-year-old 1.25 inch tongue and groove, which is unique in the fact that it's already strong enough all by itself to meet the standard for installing tile on top of it. However, you can tell by the movement that it's really not that well put together. So what I've done is I actually opened up the floor here so I could get access to my crawl space, because we wanted to be able to insulate this bad boy. And now that that's all done, I've got to screw it down so that I can finish. Now the age of this home left me with a situation here where there's lots of gaps. So I don't really want to be trusting this alone to put my flooring on. It's old, it's ugly, there's gaps, there's cracks, there's gonna be dust blowing continually every step, susceptible to curling and heaving. So we're just gonna screw it down all over again. And you could use what I was just using. That was a 2.5 inch flooring screw, or you can use a construction screw. It doesn't really matter at this point. When you're done, you're going to install a finished piece of plywood. Now, if you're in a regular house, you're going to have OSB as a subfloor. Usually it's 5/8, sometimes 3/4. You're going to have to measure. The best thing to do is just take out your heat register and put a measuring tape there and double check. But you want to get to 1.25 inches. 1.25 is really the standard for any tile. If you're putting in any other kind of flooring, the subfloor that comes with the house is fine. But if you want to eliminate squeaks in your subfloor, you can go and screw it down. Most building code construction does not require the use of screws to install subflooring. It doesn't even require adhesive. Now, some best building practices out there, they're gluing down their subfloor, but in most cases, that's not going to be the way it is. So if you want to get rid of squeaks in your floor, just identify your nail lines, the existing nails that are in the floor. That's where your floor joist will be. And you just come along with your screws and you screw right next to the nail. And then you'll have a board that when you step on, it isn't pushed down underweight and then lifting where the nail is. Because that's what happens. It's called deflection. When you push down one side of the board, it lifts at the joint. So most squeaks happen where two pieces of plywood meet together on a joist. They're nailed down. Someone will step beside it and it lifts the plywood. And the squeak is actually the sound of the wood rubbing up and down on the nail as it's slowly pulling it out of the floor. It's dramatic. The way to solve that problem, grab a box of flooring screws, screw down all your joists before you install your flooring, and then you will avoid squeaks forever. Okay, and I think a couple more here ought to be enough. Now in my situation, I have extremely old floors. And I'm not even gonna go in with ceramic. But because I got a bit of an OCD and I like a clean workspace, I'm gonna go over with 3/8 plywood, just so I have a nice clean surface. It just makes it easier for me to manage and to put down my flooring layers on top of that, knowing I've got a nice level flat surface. And to be honest with you, this old floor here, it's still got a little bit of like an oil smell, right? I don't know what it was back in those days, but they got tar and oil all over all of the flooring in this house. Probably from cowboys in their boots. I have no idea. and I know, someone's gonna say, well, why don't you just restore the softwood, like sand it down and refinish it? The bottom line is this is 140-year-old softwood, which makes it extremely soft, all right? It's not in the greatest condition. It'll transfer load still, but if I start sanding this down, I'm going to end up with just a big pile of dust, and I'm going to burn through most of this wood before I get a nice level surface. The house itself, even the foundation, is a little bit all uneven. So the more I try to repair what's existing, the worse the situation's going to get. So it's best for me to just try to put a new floor on over top and move on with my life, because in a lot of cases, restoring old product takes so much time and energy, it's just not worth the investment. All right, what do we got here? We got 8 feet. It's my first sheet of plywood right there. So the room itself is just a little bit more than 8 feet long of available floor space, and it's about 6.5 feet wide. So generally what I recommend is find out if you can put down a full sheet of plywood before you start. In this case, it comes in front of the toilet if it come off the wall. So yes, I can put down one sheet of plywood, and that gives me two things. It gives me a clean space to work from, but it also gives me straight edges. So all of my cuts, I have a nice square reference point in order to measure from. So that's the secret. If you're doing subflooring and you have plumbing fixtures in their way, try to get the one biggest piece that you can fit in that room to get started with that has factory edges, and then it's really easy to measure and mark and go square off of that to fill in all the gaps. So on this job, I'm using a 3/8 plywood. It's very important here to remember you're looking for 1¼ as a bare minimum, okay? So the way you can tell is regular plywood, every one of these layers is 1/8. So you have 3 of them, it's 3/8. If you have 5 of them, it's 5/8, 4 is a half. It's simple math. Now the new metric plywood, if you're in Canada, be careful because they have a thin laminated layer on the top and bottom and then a sandwich thick layer in the middle. And it comes in millimeters and it's not exact. But if you're in the United States or you're buying standard dimensional lumber, standard plywood, it'll all be 1/8 layers. And that is the way we tell. So if you lift off your heat vent and you look at your plywood, you can count the layers that are there, and that'll tell you how many 1/8 thick your plywood is, and you'll know how many to add to get to 1¼ which is 10/8. Yes, you need 10 layers of this little plywood here before you're ready for tile. Like I said, if you're not doing tile, what you have now is probably fine. One other thing you need to know here, all these sheet goods are run off on a conveyor belt system, and they're laminated together and they all have a bend, they all have a curve. You can see that? When you're gonna go lay it down, mark the top side, okay? Which is, you wanna install it like a bowl. So you wanna have, you wanna lay this down so that the curve goes up on the sides. All right? So when it's laying there, you have to step on the plywood to set it down. So now I'm going to explain to you why you want to install it with the bowl, like a happy face. When you're screwing this down, you want to create a plywood so that you're screwing down the edges. If you lay it this way, okay, then you're compressing that wood when you screw it down. Because the actual measurement on the top side of the plywood is larger than the bottom side. So if you're like this and you screw it down, now you're putting your plywood under compression. And if you get into a season of expansion, you get moisture and humidity or more temperature, the wood will expand, and now there's gonna be upwards pressure on all of your screws. And what you're gonna cause there is you're gonna cause a failure on the screw because the softwood can actually pop off the screw or it'll lift the screw right out of the floor. And that upward pressure can create cracks around all your joints. So what you want to do when you're putting down your plywood is you start right in the middle, okay? And this is a lot like baking. Imagine you're making bread and you've got your mound of dough. And what you're doing is you're rolling it out, okay? And it's the same thing with your plywood. You want to start screwing from the middle and roll it out. So you screw towards the edge, back, and you work left to right, middle to the outside, and that's how you lay it all out. If you do all your edges first, and then you do the middle, again, you run the same risk of creating compression in the middle. So roll out all your plywood, screw down the entire sheet before you go get another one, because if you just throw a few screws in and grab the next sheet, you haven't rolled it out properly, and you're gonna create compression. I know it doesn't sound like a big deal, but when we're putting our plywood down, we wanna have all the joints relatively tight. We're not looking for big gaps for expansion and contraction. So you really wanna make sure that if you do this, you do it the right way. That way, you aren't going to get these crack lines in your grout and your tile just because the plywood went and grew on you. So the proper way to install your screws, first of all, so this is a flooring screw, and the thread is alternating tight and coarse thread, okay? It's an alternating fine and coarse thread all up and down that shaft. And the idea is, it's compressing each layer of that plywood on the screw to the piece of wood that's underneath it. So you want to put these every 8 inches in the body of the plywood. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous. Every 2 to 3 inches along the perimeter. And you want that head to just be underneath the surface. You don't want to go too deep, or you're only compressing the 2 layers on the plywood, not the 3. This is what I was talking about. When you're rolling out the plywood, okay, you're starting in the middle, and it doesn't take a lot of screws to hold this plywood in place. When you get to the edges, that's where rolling it out really comes into effect. And so we're actually stitching this down. The next piece of plywood is going to have a screw every 2 inches as well, right up against the edge. And that's what's going to guarantee that the edges aren't going to pop up over time. Really, it's all about a little bit of overkill here, because most homes that have wooden subfloors have a central heating system, which means you're in a 3 or 4 season climate. So you're going to get hot and cold weather, and naturally your house is going to have expansion contraction. Most situations, the transition from one season to the next, there's some humidity issues, some temperature issues. Your floor isn't going to change that much. But the reason we go through all this dramatic situation, that's for those days where the heat fails. And you go 24 hours because of a power failure and your house gets really, really cold. Everything wants to shrink up on you. This kind of scenario, we're doing this for those events. We're not doing it for everyday wear and tear. We're installing this plywood to make sure that in extreme situations, which will happen over the lifespan of any floor, that it's not going to fail on you. So don't cut corners on this. This is one of the most common things you'll see in the marketplace. Guys will cut corners installing their plywood because of course it's going to work for 2, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, but it's not going to make it 50. And they don't care because they are long gone by then. Now, if you're planning on doing a lot of this flooring, you can actually buy a stand-up screw gun, and the screws come on a strip, and you can stand there and just pound them through the floor, and you can do this a lot faster. But what I found is, on this channel, if I show you the most basic approach, and you're able to have confidence in doing it, it's easy to take the next step and rent a tool that makes life easier. But not everybody can afford to rent tools that make it easier. So I'd rather show you a way that anybody can do. And there you go. That's it. So when in doubt, 6 inches, maybe 8. The width of your hand is usually around the right size. Okay? Every 2 inches on the edge. Install it like a bowl. Roll it out. Start in the middle. Work towards your edge. And you're going to be just fine installing your plywood. Remember, always make sure everything's clean underneath before you start, or you will get that nasty crunching sound when you're walking on your floor later. So this is what it's supposed to look like if you're prepping for tile, right? 6 to 8 inches in the middle, 2 inches all around the outside. I, however, am not putting tile in here. I'm just putting this down so that I can have a nice clean floor without all the gaps and cracks, so I can control my dirt, and just makes me feel better as a human being, I think. So I'm going to be going over top of this with a floating floor. We're going to put in a heated flooring system with a laminate vinyl plank, right? So make sure you check out the link for that video in the description below. And if you're watching this when it's first released, no, the video comes out in a few days. So, so all we're doing is we're just going to go every 8 inches. Okay? We're not going to do the stitching along the outside of the edge because I'm not worried about movement on a floating floor. I'm not going to get gaps and cracks appearing on a floating floor over top of plywood. So I don't have expansion contraction worries. I'm just trying to tighten this down so I eliminate excessive movement when I'm walking. Okay, so we're going to go through the measuring and cutting techniques now for installing this in your floor. And then after we're done this, we're just going to go through a real quick recap and a few other little notes that I've got for you for things that people do that they make mistakes and they cause problems, just so that you're aware. Okay, so stay with us here. Usually I just use a pencil, but for the purpose of the camera, I'm going to use my black marker so that you can see what's going on. Now the idea, basic rule of law with any sheet good that's going anywhere in a house, you want to stagger your joints, right? So it'd be really easy for me to measure from this corner going this way for the detail around the tub. But I'm going to go to the outside wall. So what I need to do is I need to take this measurement Okay, I want to just make a note. I'm 11¼ inches away from this corner. What I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract that 1/4 inch from my measurement because nothing in a room is ever square. This will give me the freedom to cut and install and not worry about going right up to the drywall, because we're still going to be adding all of our skirt or baseboard or trim board, whatever it is that you call it. Okay, so I'm going to take my rafter square and I'm going to just draw that line so I can extend the line of my plywood. And now I'm going to measure to the wall. And that again is 19 3/8. I'm going to just go with 19, okay? Always give yourself up to 1/2 inch of extra space when you're going near the edge of a floor. No one's ever going to put all of their weight on a 1/16 of an inch of flooring just before the baseboard and cause a problem, okay? So give yourself that mercy, or you're going to find it very uncomfortable working. The other end actually is 19 1/2, so this piece is going to go in relatively square. Yay, 19 inches. Now, because the plywood comes, the outside corners are square, we're going to assume that this corner here is going to be square. That'll be a factory edge up against the factory edge. That'll be the square. So when we're going to be measuring, we're going to be cutting based on the square of the plywood. Okay, so always measure from the square corner all of your numbers. It's just like grade 5 math, right? Now here's where we get our tricks and tips. Now what this does here is this gives me the ability to run up and down my edge. All right, and I have a straight edge now that I can follow. Well, here we go. So I need to measure from the outside edge of the plywood to where the toilet flange comes. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a map on the plywood here of my floor. I'm going to put my toilet flange here, and I'm going to put the hole for the water supply on there. And I'm going to take all my dimensions, draw it on this clean plywood, take a picture, and I'm going to take that information over with me to where the plywood is and then translate that information at the saw station. So I'm going to take from here, I'm going to take 11 inches. So I'm measuring from the plywood, adding 11 when I'm done. Here, I don't know if this makes sense. This square runs against the plywood. I run this one against the T-square. I get up close to the toilet. Very important here. Let me just draw this out. This is basically the average toilet base. The average toilet base will come around a toilet like that. Okay? And if your plywood doesn't come inside that edge, when you put the toilet on it, if your plywood comes to here and you put the toilet on, your flooring is going to buckle. It's going to be under compression. You're not going to get a good seal. And every time somebody uses the facility, it's going to be wiggling and loosening and cracking, and there's going to end up having a problem with water getting out of the wax ring. So make sure you get your plywood as tight to this ring as you can. And this is how you do it. Right up. There's my exact measurement. So I'm going to use this point here to measure. I'm coming out exactly 45 inches. I'm adding the 11 because I'm going to start from that wall. So 45 and 11, I'm going 55 inches to the toilet flange. Okay, we'll do the same thing on the other side. We'll use the inside of the number this time. 52 1/4 plus 11. I'm going to draw this line here. 52 is 63 1/4. Okay, I'm going exact. And then I'm going to do the same thing here for the water line. That's 57 1/2. And that here, 68 1/2. Let's take your exact measurement, adding this number here. That way, all this information will be translated onto our plywood and installed from this point here, okay? And it'll just drop in place. Now, the only other numbers we need are the distance from the factory edge to these 3 locations. And that is actually a simple, I'll get this out of here now, because we have center line on the flange. We can actually measure this way. So in the front, it doesn't matter. Remember, toilet is going to have a base that goes out like this. Okay, so it's not as crucial here to worry about this area. But for OCD's sake, we're going to go at 2 1/2. So I'm going to cut my plywood around here. And on the other side, I'm going to go at 10 1/4. Okay, and that'll cut it just about here, which is well inside the line of a toilet, so we aren't going to have a compression. So let me just check that again. 10 1/4, 2 1/2. So here we go. Let's get it on the armor. 10 1/4. And what I'm going to do with this pipe here is I'm actually just going to measure the center line area. So it's about 12 3/4 of an inch. And I know that this is a water supply. 12 3/4. And so when I go to cut that, I just take my saw and I make about a 1 by 1 inch square, and that'll be fine. Here we go. So now I got all my information. Okay, and whoops, I'm missing one piece of information. I didn't get the measurement to the wall. I did, but I didn't translate it. 19. That's 19. This is 96. So here we go. We've got the thickness to the wall. It's a full sheet of plywood. All my dimensions for my cuts. I'm going to take my picture now. There we go. And that's what I'm going to take to the saw station. So I only have to get up once, make all my cuts, come back and install it. Perfect every time. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to translate all this information. So we're just transferring all the information and then we'll cut it out. Here's my toilet. So that's my center line. I'm marking the center of the toilet. I'm going to put my pinky right there and my marker, and I'm just going to draw a circle now. Use your hand like a protractor. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it'll get you close. All right, and then just like drywall, you can use your marker. There we go. Now we got our cutting edge. So remember I was talking about the shape of a toilet, how it sits over and around the flange. Generally speaking, when you're installing subfloor, you're looking for a simple process with one tool. That's your circular saw. The joke is a circular saw doesn't cut in a circular motion. So what we have to do is cut it a little bit differently with the idea of not extending past where the toilet goes. So I'm going to show you my system, and it's just a plunge cut in multiple angles. And you don't want to get too picky here. All right? Now you'll see I'm well inside the shape of a toilet. I'm outside the circle that I drew, so I'm going to go over top of the flange. And if I don't, it's a real easy fix. Now I just got to cut the water line out, and it's very much the same thing. There's nothing worse when you're doing something like subflooring than running back and forth and trying to be perfect. This is not finished carpentry. It's like I say when I'm putting up the walls, it's just drywall. Get it cut, get it in, worry about the details later. But it is important to understand the mistakes that you could make and how to avoid that. There we go. All right. Get it over that water line there. Beautiful. And bam. Now, I am going to try to keep the sides as close as I can because that is the most crucial part of the toilet. There we go. That is going to work. Awesome. Okay, so here we go. Now remember what I said. We're going to go factory joint to factory joint. All right, we're going every 8 inches. Now because this is around the toilet, I am going to get this nice and tight. I hate movement around the toilet because when we install a toilet, we're using a wax ring. And the wax ring should be installed and the toilet should be tightened under compression, and then it should never move again. The biggest problem people have with toilets is they don't have everything around the toilet nice and tight so that when you sit on the toilet, it moves. So you can have the best compression in the world, but if you don't have everything in your substrate installed properly, over time it's going to move, and then you're going to break the seal of the wax, water's going to get through, and then all your work is going to get destroyed. So take the extra minute right now. Now remember when I did all the plunge cuts, I have a bunch of pieces of plywood where the cut lines go past the wood. So here's what I do. I actually put a screw on each section of this cut plywood, and I stitch the entire circle. Now I don't see everybody doing this. I might be a little bit crazy here. All right, but I'm going to stitch every part of this plywood together with the floor underneath because I don't want anything moving around on me. All right, and this is one of the ways that I avoid having plumbing problems down the road. Now I know that whole area is about as tight as it's ever going to get. After that, it's really simple. Every 8 inches, finish laminating this bad boy, and then we'll just use the same technique. We'll cut a little piece there, a little piece at the other end. Voila, we have a floor. If I'm on tile, then this is a problem, right? So I do the same thing. Okay, so I mentioned earlier in the video, we were going to talk about the mistakes that people make. Number one, they put a cut edge up against the factory edge. As soon as you start doing that, you've lost how tight your seam is, and you're going to mess up your contraction and your expansion, and a lot of the materials you're going to put on here, trust me, you can't measure and install plywood unless you're going factory edge to factory edge. Try to keep that factory edge in mind. When you're cutting around fixtures, give yourself a little bit of room, okay? It's okay to overcut so that you have flexibility, but tighten everything up. When you're going up against tubs and shower pans, leave 3/8 of an inch from the plywood to the acrylic base. You do not want them coming in contact together. That is one of the largest reasons for callbacks on tile jobs, is because people put the plywood up against the acrylic, and then when you go in your tub or you fill it with water or you walk in your shower, the pan moves and it rubs against the plywood, makes that squeaking sound, and everybody starts going crazy. Why is there a squeak? Why? It's just because of that. It's cosmetic. So leave the gap and fill up that area, not with grout at the end. Use a nice bit of silicone to finish that edge later. One of the other mistakes people make is they don't use enough. All right, let's be honest. The biggest problem with tile failure and installing subfloor is people put on 1 inch or 1 1/8 inch of subfloor and they don't go all in. If you have 5/8 subfloor, which is really standard in new home construction, you need to add another 5/8. Don't go cheap and add 3/8. Don't try to save money and go with 1/2 inch. You've got to get the right amount of substrate or there's going to be too much deflection in your floor and your whole job will fail. I'll guarantee it. I don't care what anybody says. Don't let anybody do that to your home, okay? There is a minimum standard for a reason. Stick to it. Other than that, the only other thing people do wrong with their subfloor is they don't keep it clean. Big mistake, all right? Nice to put this in near the end of a job. If you're like me and you're right in the middle of a project and you're getting it done because you're waiting for things to dry, make sure that you keep it covered, a tarp, or when you're all done and you're ready to tile or put on your finished flooring, wash it all down, get rid of all of that organics and muds and stuff like that so that everything will bond well. And if you want to see how this project turns out and you're interested about that heated flooring with the vinyl, then click the link right here. This is going to be an awesome video. It's going to change a lot of lives.